experience in almost all sectors after coronavirus and COVID-19 disease. Of all the various industries, one major part to be concerned is the real estate sector. Some of us have investments, some are planning to invest, but there is a shade between the future trends and we are all in a vulnerable state. We all need answers to the questions in our mind about the future. I am very happy to announce another international expert for today, Mr. Andrew Pearson. Andrew, I want to speak a little bit about the background of Andrew. Andrew has over 15 years of experience in the CEE and CSEE real estate markets, together with 4 years in the United Kingdom. He joined JLL in 2001 and relocated to Czech Republic office in 2005 to run the agency departments in Prague. Since then, Andrew managed in the Bulgarian, Serbian, Croatian offices, and in his most recent role, Andrew was responsible for the JLL operations across Southeastern Europe from the offices in Bucharest and Belgrade. This involved overseeing work across 8 different countries, including Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Slovenia. During his time in Central East Europe and Southeast Europe, Andrew has led marketing campaigns on some of the most high-profile office schemes in cities such as Prague, Bratislava, Sofia, Belgrade, and advised key occupiers across multiple markets. He has also provided key advice to investors on their portfolios across the region and has been involved in transactions in SEE over the past 5 years, the total volume exceeding 1 billion euros. Andrew joined CBRE in July 2018 to oversee the expansion across SEE with offices in Belgrade and Sofia. I'm very happy to introduce Andrew. So Andrew, you are on stage. I wish you a good and successful speech.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I think that the aim of today is to, well, I think this presentation 2 or 3 months ago would have been very different as it is today. So what I'll try and do is talk about the region, what's going on in the region generally across Southeastern Europe, but also Central and Eastern Europe. And also what we're seeing in terms of the impacts of COVID on the real estate markets, because undoubtedly there are major impacts in real estate because of the virus and what's going on. So what I'll do is we'll touch upon where we currently are at the moment in terms of what's happening, and then moving on to kind of the cities and what's going on in each of them and what we expect to happen going forward. And I think what it will do, it will give a flavour of what potentially you can look out for in Albania, because I think it's good to look when you're in a market like Albania that's kind of at its early stages of development to see how other similar countries were maybe 5-10 years ago, because I think that helps kind of give an image of what could be in the future for markets like Albania. And I would say for Albania, and I've been down to Albania quite a few times, I really enjoy going to Tirana actually. It's a country that's probably in a lucky sense that it has so many other countries that it can learn from. So it's at its early stage of the cycle, and what it can do, it can look at countries like Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, countries that are not so dissimilar in size, and see how they grew and what they did wrong and what they did right. And it's kind of a lucky situation for Albania being one of the kind of the last markets to grow, is that there's a lot of other countries that it can kind of copy on. And that's how countries like the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary grew, because they were really just replicating what people had done in Austria and Germany. And so everybody always kind of copies from similar markets that are kind of 5 or 10 years ahead. And so when looking at all these markets, it gives a good indication of what potentially could be the future for a market like Albania. So what I'll do, I'll just go through kind of where we are at the moment. Let me just see if I can, yeah, okay. I'm almost contractually bound to put this kind of slide up, so we'll jump across this one. But that, if you look at the green in the map, that's what we call Southeastern Europe, and that's really the last emerging region in the market across Europe. So we have offices in Belgrade and Sofia, but we do a lot of work outside. Croatia, Slovenia, particularly are large markets for us. Slovenia is a complete different market than the rest of the region. It really mirrors what's going on in Slovenia, in Italy and Austria, not really what's going on in Bulgaria, Romania. So the rest of the region has those similarities, though, kind of Serbia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Albania. They're more similar in terms of the activity and what's going on, and we'll go through that today. So look, let's start with going through the obvious of what's actually happening now in terms of real estate. What we'll do is we'll focus on three sectors, which are offices, retail, and industrial. And we'll be talking about what is currently happening and what we think the long-term impact is going to be. So I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail, but we'll just start with this slide. So in terms of offices, it's a real, I would say that the key word for offices is uncertainty. Nobody really knows. You know, I didn't know 2 months ago that I would be working from home for 2 months. And so the impact of that, we don't quite know yet, because, you know, companies that didn't have any type of home working mentality are now having to change completely their direction. And it means that companies going forward don't quite know how much office space they're going to need. On one hand, they need less space because there will be more people working from home. Yet, on the other hand, there will be a complete change in the way that offices are built in terms of the layouts of office space. And social distancing is something that's not going to be a short-term thing. It's here for the long term. And so if a company is trying to maintain the same amount of people and they will be working from the office, then actually companies will need more space, because you won't be able to squeeze people in like sometimes happens. You will have social distancing issues. And so in terms of the office market, we don't quite know yet what the future holds. In SEE and CE, the office markets are very, very important. They're kind of the big growth markets. And we need a lot of offices for companies to enter and grow into these regions. So where we are now is that most people are working from home. Deals aren't happening. We're not seeing many leases being signed. Companies are not relocating. If they were planning to relocate, they're now choosing to stay where they were and try and do short-term deals. So they'll give themselves more time to kind of understand where the future is. And we're potentially seeing rents reduced, that companies are not financially as strong, that they will start looking at trying to reduce rents. You know, in terms of, let me just move across here because I can't see it myself. Yeah, I mean, you know, flexible working office solutions is something that's always been growing. So there will be an increase without question of facilities like WeWork and companies going into work in flexible office solutions. We're also seeing, which again is something that I couldn't believe would happen, is that a lot of the big global corporate companies are actually putting budgets together now to give people money to create an office in their own home. So rather than invest in an office, they will be pushing people to work from home. They know a lot of people don't have an extra room for a study, and so there are a lot of companies are now budgeting funds to give their employees to try and make their home an easier place to also work. So these are things that people weren't thinking about, and now all of a sudden everybody's starting to think about these types of solutions. I'll go into this in more detail soon. With retail, without question, this is the impact. This is the sector that's impacted by far the most. Almost all shopping centres, I think pretty much every shopping centre has been closed. They're slowly reopening, but the impact is massive. And so if you look at the retailers, they've missed a whole season of sales. So they've gone from winter to summer, and all their spring collection has been missed. So they've got a lot of stock that's unsold. So there will be huge retail sales going forward. A lot of retailers are not paying rent. If you look at countries like Poland, the government has allowed tenants to rip up their contract, so anybody can leave a lease now. And obviously the other big impact is e-commerce, which is something that's not been very big in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's growing very, very quickly. And so at the moment we have around between 6 and 12% in terms of retail that's bought over the internet. If you compare that to the UK, which is almost up to 20% and growing, there is still a lot of growth in this as well. Each country is different. If you look at somewhere like Bulgaria, it's only 4%. Italy has a very low e-commerce base. People like to go shopping. But e-commerce is something that's going to grow quickly, and that will have an impact on the logistics and industrial markets, because there will be a lot more requirements for short-term storage and storage facilities close to cities in order to provide for e-commerce deliveries and storage. So in retail, it's a really difficult situation. The retail shopping owners are going through a very tough time. They're really pushing to try and get their shopping centres reopened, but it's taking a lot of time. And in terms of industrial, this is the one sector that's actually coming out of this whole situation well. People are investing in industrial. People see that the future of industrial is a lot more safe than it is for offices and retail. So we're seeing a lot of new development potentially happening. We're seeing, as we have seen for the last few years in our region, there's been a lot of manufacturing growth. So countries like Romania, Bulgaria have seen a lot of big manufacturing contracts won, certainly on the back of car manufacturing, and that's something that's been growing heavily in this region. We see that that's something that's going to grow into the future too. The main issue that we're seeing with the logistics and industrial market is supply chain. You know, a lot of goods have been coming from China that have obviously not been able to arrive. And so there's been a lot of issues around supply. All the car manufacturers in the region have closed down and are slowly reopening. So Skoda in Czech closed, the Audi, Volkswagen in Hungary closed. In Slovakia, the main car manufacturers, Volkswagen, closed. This is having major impacts on the economies in these countries. Again, we actually think this will be a short-term impact, and the longer-term impact is that the industrial market will be quite healthy. Long-term for retail is looking bad. Shopping centre owners are worried, and they've got rights to be worried. A lot of retailers have either gone bust or have really reduced on their growth expectations, and then going back to offices, it's a kind of time of uncertainty. A lot of office occupiers, ourselves included, my office is closed, we're reopening next week. The way that we're reopening is that only 50% of people can be allowed to be in the office at any single time. It's having major impacts on how companies are working and looking at offices these days. So there will be a big shift in terms of how offices are built and how they are occupied going forward. So let me just move on. Okay, so going into more detail now with the office market, like I said, a lot of the big corporate companies didn't have any type of work from home strategy. I don't work from home. I'm not somebody who can easily work from home, but it's been enforced now. And so companies are having to adapt to a forced procedure of home working that they weren't prepared for. A lot of companies are struggling with it. A lot of companies are actually seeing benefits from it. In the major cities, people who've got childcare problems or long commutes are being pushed to work from home, and we think that that will continue going forward a lot more. The occupiers, like I said, there's not a lot of deals happening, so there will be a short-term vacancy across the markets. That a lot of these new buildings that were expecting companies to relocate from other buildings into theirs, that's not going to happen now. And so a lot of companies are now staying in their current offices and trying to do short-term deals with existing landlords. That's having an impact on vacancy of new buildings, and we expect that there will be a lot of vacant new buildings over the next 12, 24 months. In terms of where transactions were, in terms of leases, if you look at the big leases that were being signed towards the end of last year, the ones that did fall into 2020 are still happening. And when we're looking at figures, and I will be showing you some figures soon, it doesn't take into account COVID yet. When we're looking at all of the figures in terms of supply and demand, what you need to understand is that Q1 of 2020 has still been very strong across Central and Eastern Europe, because it was deals that were closing and signing that started last year. Where we're going to see issues going forward is deals that start in 2020 and expect to sign in 2020 or 2021. And so we're not seeing new requirements coming out. And so we'll only really see the impact of COVID in terms of the numbers in Q3 and Q4 this year and going into next year. Q1 and Q2 of 2020 is still looking strong because I say it's carrying over from last year. It's new deals where we have the problem. It's new leases and new requirements coming out that will be filling these new buildings up, and that's the concern going forward. In terms of landlords, I mean, one of the impacts that we're seeing is a lot of our clients are contacting us trying to negotiate to get rents reduced or to not pay rents. The difference with shopping centres and office buildings is that shopping centres have been closed down by the governments. It's been by law, and therefore the retailers haven't been able to operate, and therefore they do have a right most of the time to withhold their rent during the time that the shopping centre is closed. The difference with offices is that the office buildings are all open. It's the companies inside the offices that are choosing not to operate those offices and not to have their employees working. And that's the main difference. So office buildings remain open. If I wanted to go into the office tomorrow, I could. There's no reason I couldn't go into the office. And so there is no legal reason for tenants not to pay their rent. And people need to keep that in mind. Retailers, yes, but office tenants, no. But in terms of where we're seeing, we don't really see a short-term impact on rental levels. It's going forward when we see this vacancy coming in the new buildings that there will be more vacancy coming on. And in terms of construction, what we'll see with construction activity is that you won't see a big change. The buildings that are under construction will be finished. There may be some exceptions to that, but the majority of buildings that were under construction in the whole region will be finished off. It's new construction that will not start is the issue. A lot of the banks are being very nervous about financing new development in the region, not just offices, but obviously retail too. And so it's going to be very difficult for developers to get bank financing to build new office buildings. And so we expect we will see a reduction in construction activity going forward, whilst we still have the uncertainty around the office market. But what is important is that all of the current buildings that are under construction, hopefully they should be finished. I think the last thing we need is half-finished office buildings around the cities. We do see them, we see them in Tirana at times, and it's not a good sight, and we need to try and avoid that. So it's important that the buildings under construction are all going to be finished, and we expect the majority will be. So going into retail, as I say, retail by far is the most impacted. Almost overnight, the shopping centres closed down, and people, again, just were not prepared for it. So with the exception of supermarkets and pharmacies and banks, and there were some other exceptions in certain countries like pet shops, and the majority of fashion, all retail, it closed, and it was simply overnight almost in many places. And retailers are not happy because their turnovers are non-existent. A lot of the rents have gone down because a lot of the rents are linked to the retailer's turnover. That's very common in shopping centres in the region, that the rent that the retailer pays is linked to their turnover, and it will be a percentage of their turnover. So companies like Inditex Group that have Zara and H&M and the big retailers tend to fix their rents to the turnover levels. And so the income that the shopping centre owners have been receiving over the past 2 months has been really low. And what they need to do now is to negotiate with the banks, because a lot of shopping centre owners, the income that they're receiving is not enough to pay their bank debt. And so what we're finding is that the banks are having to be very flexible with the shopping centre owners and allowing them to pay the interest only and not pay any of the principal. And so there has to be a degree of flexibility between the shopping centre owners, the retailers and the banks, because it's a difficult position for everybody to be in. With retail, there are no winners in this. I think the only winners going forward will be those investment funds that are going around trying to pick up distressed assets. That's not going to be something that's in the short term, but it will be something that will start happening. So when we're looking at the occupiers, they're going through a tough time. A lot of them are shifting really towards e-commerce and trying to keep their turnovers relatively healthy by increasing the output from e-commerce and internet shopping. But obviously in some countries there are issues around the postal system. That's something that is very common in Southeastern Europe. The postal system is just not secure enough, it's not guaranteed, and people are nervous a lot of the time to buy things over the internet. Whereas countries like Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, they've got a very strong systematic postal service that supports e-commerce. In SCE, that's not true, and so people can be very nervous about buying over the internet, and that has an impact in our region. But in terms of the retailers, certainly their expansion, there's a lot of shopping centres that are being developed across the region, which I'll show you soon. They're going to have a tough time in the next year, these new shopping centres, because the retailers are not moving into them. And a lot of them are withholding their rent. So it's a really difficult time for the retail market at the moment. Again, the landlords, they're having to be flexible with the shopping centres. They're having to allow retailers to not pay rent. It is pointless to push the retailers to pay rent during this process, because it needs a time of, like I said, flexibility, and you do not want to keep annoying your customer, which is your retailer, because they will not stay in a shopping centre long term. And so there has to be that degree of talking between landlord and tenant and finding a way to get through this. Thankfully, we're seeing the shopping centres reopen. You know, people talk about China, that there was a quick rebound in retail sales when the shopping centres opened. I think that will happen to a certain degree in our region. I don't think stores all of a sudden selling out product in one day, as we saw in China, but there will be a short-term hike and increase in retail sales over the next couple of weeks. It's whether people in the long term feel secure to go to shopping centres like they used to. When you look at retail, a lot of the question marks now is, will people be happy to go into shopping centres, into covered areas with circulated space? One of the winners potentially could be retail parks and big box retail, where you've got outside parking and walking straight into the retail unit. We expect the impact of that will be less. Things like cinemas will have a struggle going forward. A lot of the cinema operators are in real problems at the moment. And we don't know what the public's response will be to going to the cinema anymore. Will people feel secure doing that if you can't even sit next to somebody? And so there's a lot of question marks over that too. And then again, in construction activity, you know, again, shopping centres are under construction. We hope will be finished. There's a shopping centre just finished and opened in Ljubljana last week. There are 2 big shopping centres due to open in Belgrade this year that should open. But in the likes of Zagreb and Sofia, we're not seeing new construction. I don't think banks will finance new retail construction. And I don't think there will be many developers desperate to build shopping centres over the next 2 to 3 years. I think people will be waiting to see what will happen. But by far, the retail market's been the hardest hit out of all of the sectors, there's no question. And then just touching on to industrial. Industrial is not really a big business for anybody in our region, because there isn't really a mature industrial market in Southeastern Europe. It's not like the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Poland of this world that have huge manufacturing and therefore a very strong logistics and industrial market. Manufacturing levels are still quite low in our region, and so there isn't really a big logistics market around that. We think that will increase. Manufacturing is increasing. We're seeing car manufacturing coming into Serbia and into Bulgaria. Volkswagen were looking at Bulgaria to open a huge manufacturing plant that is now looking at it might go to Turkey, but it could potentially come back to Bulgaria. So from a manufacturing perspective, companies are looking at the region again. And what we'll see going forward is what we call nearshoring. And so a lot of European companies put a lot of their manufacturing out to Asia, obviously because of cost. Now, the issues around having manufacturing in faraway countries is supply chain and the logistics to bring the goods back into Europe. So what we're finding is that companies will start doing what we call nearshoring, which is bringing the manufacturing back closer to where their home is. So, you know, the big French, German, British manufacturers will start bringing manufacturing back to Europe. And the markets that that's going to go to are places like Southeastern Europe, because we still have relatively cheap labour costs and skilled workforce. And so potentially on the back of manufacturing, our region actually could benefit a lot from what we call nearshoring, from these jobs manufacturing coming back out of Asia and South America and North Africa and coming back into Europe. And we really see that Southeastern Europe could be a winner on that. In terms of landlords, what we're seeing is there's been a massive short-term increase in demand for cold storage. The supermarkets have been huge winners on the back of this. People got frightened early and everybody started stocking up on items. But the supermarkets have done a very big business. A lot of the supermarkets have moved into non-food sales on the back of retail fashion being closed down. So the likes of Tesco in Czech, Poland, Hungary have increased massively their clothing allowance, what they can sell, because they know that the likes of H&M and Zara can't sell at the moment. And so they've started changing, but also there's been a big demand for cold storage to store a lot of the food that's coming in. And we're seeing a real short-term increase in that. And again, like I say, e-commerce is what we'll see the big increase of. So we will see in the long term a real increase in e-commerce. That is certainly here to stay. Look at countries like the UK. E-commerce has had a massive detrimental impact on the retail market, on the high street, on the shopping centres. There's so much being purchased over Amazon now and any other type of retail online platform. It's still quite small in our region, but it's something that will grow and grow and grow. And so we expect that will have a big impact on the industrial market because there will be big demand for logistics. The biggest tenant at the moment in Central and Eastern Europe is by far Amazon. Amazon are growing hugely in Poland and Czech, Hungary, Romania. It's still not entered our markets yet, so you still can't get Amazon purchased easily into our markets, but it will come. And so Amazon are growing enormously. And if you look at Romania, their sales are increasing tenfold. And so that will be here to stay. And again, that will have a detrimental impact on the retail market. And from construction, we're not seeing a real difference. When we talk about manufacturing in the industrial markets across our region, people don't build buildings and then hope that somebody will come and lease them. The majority of the construction that we see is what we call built to suit. So it's manufacturers choosing the country to move to and then having a building specifically built for them. And so we won't see empty industrial buildings everywhere because people don't build them in the hope that they will then lease them. People build them on the back of a deal that they already have with an occupier. And so we won't see construction slowing down with the industrial market. If anything, the industrial market will be the big winner going forward, and we expect to see construction activity, not in the short term, but in the longer term, increasing for the industrial market. So that's covering industrial, as I say, quite positive compared to the other two main sectors. So what I thought we would do, I think if we talk purely about COVID and the virus, then it will be far too depressing. So what I'm doing now is also just giving you an idea of where the rest of the region is in terms of real estate. Because like I say, it's a really useful exercise when you're in cities like Tirana to look at similar sized cities like Bratislava or Sofia to see how they have grown over the past few years. And like I say, learn from them and see what they did wrong. Now this table is useful. This gives you an idea of the level of office stock across the region. As you see, Warsaw has the largest amount of offices in Central and Eastern Europe, followed by Prague. The key point that you need to look at is that green dot, which is density. Now that is square meters per 1,000 people in the city. So if you look at Bratislava, for instance, it means that there are 2,500 square meters per 1,000 people. It means that every person in that city has 2.5 square meters of office space to use. It's far too much. And therefore, Bratislava as a market is so overdeveloped that there just isn't room to build anything else. Where you need to see a healthy density level is a city like Warsaw or Bucharest, where you have a relatively low density level of around 1 square meter per person for the city, because each person in an office building on average takes around 8 to 10 square meters. So seeing 2.5 square meters per person for the entire city is far too high. What this table also shows is where is the potential growth going forward. The potential growth cities are Belgrade, by far, is probably the city with the most development potential. It's still, for a city the size of Belgrade, it's still massively, massively underdeveloped. None of the big developers have ever come into Belgrade yet. And so the level of supply and the level of vacancy is very, very low. And therefore the rents are very, very high. So if you look at that whole graph, the rents in all of those cities, the city that has the lowest level of rent is Bratislava, because it has not a huge amount of supply, but it's a very small city. The population is 600,000, but it has the highest density level, and therefore it has the highest vacancy level, and therefore the rents are the lowest. The city that has the highest rents on average across there is actually Belgrade. You can look at cities like Prague and Warsaw that have very expensive downtown offices. In the downtown of Prague, the best buildings will lease for around 22 euros. In Belgrade, they don't lease for that much. But as an average across the city, Belgrade has the highest rents because it doesn't have any vacancy and there are no buildings. So in Prague, you could pay 22 euros, but you could also pay 8. In Belgrade, you'll pay 16 or you'll pay 14. There isn't much of a difference. And so on average, it has the highest rents. And we expect that, again, to be going forward because developers are not entering the market. So the city to learn from in terms of what not to do is Bratislava, because too much is being developed in a small city. The market with the most potential going forward out of these is Belgrade. And the market we expect to see the most growth going forward is Bucharest and Sofia, because in Bucharest and Sofia, we're seeing a lot of the big global occupiers looking for outsourcing opportunities. Cities like Prague, Budapest, Warsaw have before all of the COVID issues, had almost zero unemployment, and therefore salary levels were very, very high. Sofia and Bucharest offered office buildings, they offered vacancy, and they offered labour. And so they are perfect recipe for outsourcing, and they're the markets that are growing the quickest. So all of these cities are very, very different. But like I say, if you're looking at a market like Albania, learn from a city like Bratislava and what they've done wrong. There are some fantastic buildings in Bratislava. There's just too many of them, and too much was built too soon, and it impacted the market a lot. Moving on to vacancy levels. What we're doing now is just looking at Southeastern Europe. Just move these. Yeah, okay, that's much better. Okay, so vacancy levels across the region. Again, very, very low. Belgrade has the lowest vacancy at under 5% in the whole of Europe. The highest vacancy in the market is Sofia. But what you need to think about with vacancy is cities in our region need vacancy because we need companies to move to these cities. And companies cannot move to these cities without vacant office buildings. It's like moving to a city that doesn't have any housing. It's exactly the same principle. So we need vacancy. We need a 10% vacancy level because companies need to come, they need to find offices, and they need to be able to expand. And expansion, its entry of companies is important, but expansion of them is even more important. And so we need companies like DHL and Amazon and Honeywell and these big kind of American corporates. We need them to enter this region and we need them to expand. And the only way they can expand is if there's office buildings to expand into. And so the vacancy rates are very, very low in our region. They're too low and we still need to see more. So actually the vacancy going forward on a positive side might influence occupiers to actually choose this region to move to because vacancy levels are high and rents might drop. At the moment, those rents were, as of Q1 2020, we expect the rents in all of these cities over the next 6 months to drop. We won't see massive drops in the rents. Landlords will still not be under massive pressure because the vacancy levels are still low. Companies are not just going to leave these cities, and so landlords will know that there's still not many other buildings for them to move to, so they're not going to just drop rents from 15 to 10. There will be a slow reduction in rents going forward, but it will be relatively small, but we will see rents dropping. And we expect the biggest rent drops to probably be in Belgrade and Sofia, because that's where we'll see probably more vacancy coming forward. So that's worthwhile to keep an eye on. But reducing the rents in our region is probably not a bad thing, because as an average, they're probably a little bit too high for the markets in terms of affordability of the buildings. Okay, and then just going on. What does the future hold? Like I say, it's most of the transactions we're certainly involved in, that we have been involved in, are signing, they're closing, and that's good. The challenge going forward is now decisions being made for the next 6-12 months. Tenants are not going to come to us and say, we want to expand or we want to move buildings. What they're going to say to us is, we want to stay in our current building and we want a rent reduction. That is going to be 90% of the requirements going forward over the next 6 to 12 months. So landlords are going to have to be flexible and give short-term contracts to existing tenants. And it's a good time for landlords to potentially improve their relations with their tenants too. So if I was a landlord of an office building in this region today and one of my major tenants said, I want to just take a 12-month extension, I would give it to them. I wouldn't push for a 5-year, because I think that showing that flexibility now will enhance the relationship, and I think it will improve the relationships going forward. There will be downward pressure on rents. We will see rents dropping, and we will see rising vacancy in these new buildings. You know, new buildings that are built, when you're building an office building, you expect to fill that building up with tenants within 6 to 12 months of the completion. That's generally what you would predict and what you would assume when you're trying to get your financing, that the building would be full 6 to 12 months after completion. That's probably not going to happen with a lot of the buildings now, so we will see a longer period for these buildings to start filling up. And there will be pressure sometimes from the banks, and so the banks are going to have to be flexible too. And there will be this need for more remote work. Companies will, individuals will have got, some people hate working from home, but some people will have enjoyed this experience and will be pushing their employers to allow them to do more of it. And so employers are going to have to be more flexible going forward to allow their staff. People, you know, if you look at London, for instance, people are not comfortable getting on the London tube today because it's terrible at the best of times. Now, if there's virus problems going around, people are not going to sit on a hot tube for 1 hour a day. It's just not going to happen, or on trains. And so there will be demands now from employees to allow themselves to work from home, and the employers are going to have to be flexible to that. And so we will see a lot more remote working, and we will see a lot more companies adapting to that. And like I say, even to the point where companies will be budgeting money to buy desks or chairs for their employees, so they'll have a more comfortable office environment to work in, you know, so they're not working from their sofa, but actually they'll feel that they're working at a proper desk. And it will be, a lot of global companies will start paying for that for their employees to be able to work from home. So it will have a major impact on the office market. And with construction, like I said, ongoing projects will be finished, but I expect new developments will be slowing down, and we'll see a real reduction in new developments going forward. Nearshoring, I touched on earlier on, we will see companies moving back to Europe from Asia. A lot of the big outsourcing that went to countries like India, again, will start coming back. And that's where countries like Albania and the rest of the region surely should benefit, because, you know, this outsourcing is not going to come from France to India and then back to France. It will look for new destinations. And Southeastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe still offers relatively cheap labour costs to be able to get those requirements back. At the moment, the big winners are the big Romanian cities. So the big requirements that are going around at the moment tend to be going to Romania. Romania is a country that offers a lot of cities. It offers 5 or 6 cities of over 1 million people per city. And it's ripe for outsourcing. And so cities like Cluj, Timișoara, Bucharest, Iași are seeing big requirements coming in. Amazon now have, I think, 4,000 people in Iași. I mean, look at somewhere like Sofia. Hewlett-Packard have got 6,000 people working in Sofia. And so there's big global outsourcing already to our region, and we expect to see that growing going forward too, and we need to see that. And like I say, that's because of labour costs. And what I think is what we need to be thinking out in terms of positivity is we don't expect companies to leave the region. Companies are not going to leave Southeastern Europe and move to Asia. So the companies that are already here will keep on expanding. So there are some positives to look at when you're looking at this, because companies will be trying to keep their costs in control, and that's where our region can offer advantages to that. So it's not all negative. Retail is negative. And again, when I'm talking about cities to learn from, there's Bratislava again. Massively overdeveloped. Far too many shopping centres in such a small city. And it already has the lowest rental rates in the region, and we'll see some massive impacts on that. The rest of the region is relatively calm. We don't really see new shopping centres being built today in the likes of Prague, Budapest, Warsaw. We certainly don't see them in Bratislava. In Sofia, we've stopped seeing retail development. We saw a lot of it in the past. And in Bucharest, it's very difficult to build retail, and we're not seeing a lot of that. So we're not, even before this, we weren't seeing a great deal of retail development happening in our region. In Southeastern Europe, it's slightly different. Like I said, there's 2 big shopping centres opening this year in Belgrade. One opened just last week, amazingly, in Ljubljana. And there is another one being planned in Zagreb. And so we are seeing more in Skopje. There's a big shopping centre under construction. So we are seeing activity still in our region, but it's not as much, thankfully, as it used to be in the past. But anything that wasn't planned, shopping centres that are under construction should finish, but I don't expect we'll see any more new construction for the foreseeable future in any retail. Even if the developer wanted to build, I don't think retailers would be filling up that shopping centre, and I don't think you would get banks today that would finance new development, and so that will slow down construction. So this is where we are in Southeastern Europe across those 4 major cities. Already density level, Ljubljana has the highest density. It has the lowest supply because it's a very small city in terms of population. It has the highest density, and Sofia has the highest amount of stock, but it has quite a healthy level of density. So the shopping centres that are in Sofia perform well. There isn't need for any more. In Zagreb, there is a lot of shopping centres. The density level is very high. And there is another one under construction. So Zagreb's a city that still has pressure on its retail market, and it will get worse. Where we'll see the big change going forward is in Belgrade. Belgrade's always been the city that has the lowest density level. It's always had 2 or 3 shopping centres that outperform, and there hasn't been any competition. We're seeing 2 major shopping centres being built at the moment, and it will have a massive impact on the shopping centre market in the next 6 to 12 months. There's a shopping centre in Belgrade being built at the moment that's almost 100,000 square metres. It's massive, and that will have a major impact on the market. And so it will be interesting over the next 12 months how both the existing shopping centres perform and also how the new shopping centres perform, and if the retailers that have signed contracts to move into them will actually turn up to those stores, or if they'll find a way to actually cancel those agreements. So retail, in terms of supply, we're not seeing a great deal of change. Belgrade's the only one, it's the only city that we're seeing major change. And like I say, in Skopje, we're seeing 1 shopping centre and now a second shopping centre coming through. A much bigger shopping centre than the existing one that's already there, and it will have a big impact on the existing shopping centre that's sat there. And as I say, average rents are very, very high already in the region. The average rents for shopping centres in Belgrade are far too high. It was never sustainable, and it's because there wasn't enough stock. We would have already seen the rents drop in Belgrade over the next 6 to 12 months. We will see an even bigger drop now because of COVID and the issues over the retailers. We've seen consistency in the other markets in terms of retail rents, but we expect that they will go down too. So in terms of income, by far, retail will be the most negatively impacted going forward, and we expect to see fairly large-scale rent reductions in the next 6 to 12 months. Also, in terms of valuation, it's very difficult to value a shopping centre today. I won't be giving a valuation seminar, but obviously, when you're valuing a shopping centre, you're valuing what we call the NOI, the net operating income per year. Now, we'll see a period of 3 months where they'll receive relatively no income at all. Now, how do you impact that into a valuation? You can't assume that the value will be like that going forward over time, but you also can't ignore the fact that we're going through this difficult situation. And so it's a very difficult situation now in terms of how we value shopping centres, where we expect to see rents going forward. We have to reduce the value of shopping centres in general going forward, but we're at a very difficult position in order to do that because we don't yet know the impact yet. We'll only know the impact once the shopping centres reopen, once the customers return, and once we start seeing turnover levels again. And if we see that there will be consistently drop, then the value of the shopping centres will also in turn reduce. And so it's a little bit early, but we will see a reduction in values. I think I've covered this in terms of talking there, but as I say, in terms of retailers, their expansion, which is bad news for countries like Albania, we need new retailers generally into our region. that expansion of retailers will now slow down. They won't be trying to move into new countries quite as quickly as they were doing before. We already have the major retailers like Inditex and H&M. LPP have been growing in, but then retailers like Peek and Kloppenburg that have finally entered into Belgrade, they will slow their expansion down going forward. And so for countries like Albania, this will impact the retail market probably for a year or two. The retailers that were looking to enter will probably slow down now. We will see a reduction in rent, like I say, and we will see an increase in vacancy. We don't yet know how many shops will reopen in the shopping centres when the shopping centres reopen. We don't expect to see all of the shops reopen when those shopping centres reopen. Some retailers will have gone bankrupt. A lot of the local retailers, a lot of local traders don't have long-term cash reserves, and it will be a point where you will see empty retail units simply because the retailer has gone bankrupt. And the challenge will be how easy it is to release a lot of those retail units. And like I say, we've talked about it. E-commerce will have a major impact going forward. Everybody's been forced to start buying things on the internet. Again, that forcing of them doing that, people who potentially haven't bought much over the internet in the past will have realised how easy it is to do, and therefore will continue to do it. So like those people that have got used to working from home and will continue to do it, people will start now buying more over the internet because they've realised it's easier than they thought, and that will have an impact on the retail markets. And we will see a postponement of new shopping centres going forward too. In investment, I mean, the investment market is something that's still quite immature, but obviously this is the most important thing. All of the buildings that we're talking about in all of those markets, all of the shopping centres, all the office buildings, with the exceptions of one or two, they are built to sell. So they're building them to lease them and then to sell to an investor. And that's the end game. Where our region can often struggle is a lot of big developers will only enter a market if they can guarantee that when they've finished building their building and leased it, that they can sell it then to an investor. So someone like Skanska, the big Swedish developer, who are probably the biggest developer in Central and Eastern Europe over the past 10 years. Now, they're not in Slovenia, they're not in Croatia, they're not in Serbia, Albania, Macedonia. The reason for that is because they don't have the feeling that once that building's finished, that they can sell it to an investor. They don't have that security. Where they know that in Czech, Poland, Hungary, even Romania, once that building's finished, they will be able to sell it to an investor. So they'll be able to lease it and they'll be able to sell it. That's where our market struggles the most, because we cannot guarantee developers that once they've finished their building, they can sell it to an investor. And if we can't promise them that and guarantee them that, they will not come. We did have, a few years ago, a very short-term window where we had a huge amount of South African money. I'm sure maybe some of you may have got involved in parts of it or seen it on the news or read about it. We had 1 or 2 years where the South African economy was in real trouble, and there was a lot of South African capital getting out of South Africa, and they don't really differentiate our region to others. So they don't look at a country like Bulgaria that differently than they would look at Poland. In Poland, you could buy shopping centres for 5.5%, and in Bulgaria, it's 7.5%, 8.5%. To them, it's just a country in Eastern Europe that's far away from them. So they weren't valuing the countries differently. So they were quite happy to come into our markets. And so what we found is that South Africans started buying shopping centres in Macedonia and Montenegro and Bulgaria. We got very close to buying a shopping centre for a South African investor in Tirana, for instance. So that was a very short-term window, but it gave a lot of people security that if you built a shopping centre, you could sell it. The issue is those South Africans are gone again, and we've not managed to replace them with another investor group. So we're still having this challenge now that there are not enough investors coming to buy finished product. We have a lot of local and regional developers. We still have a lot of developers coming out of countries like Israel, but we're not seeing investors. We're not seeing the big German investment groups or the big British or American investment groups coming in and buying existing shopping centres and office buildings. And that is where our markets struggle the most. We can get occupiers, we can get office occupiers, we can get companies to lease those offices, but we can't then get investors to sell them. And that's where our region struggles the most. And that is our biggest challenge going forward. So when we're looking at yields, when we're valuing assets, it's very difficult because when you're valuing an office building in Prague, for instance, you look at the last office building that was sold in Prague, you compare it to the one you're valuing, and you make the assumption. So there might be a building down the road sold off a yield of 6%. And if your building is pretty much the same, you value your building at 6%. It's really that simple. In our region, we're valuing office buildings in Zagreb. There hasn't been an office building sold in Zagreb for 5 years. So how do we value that office building in Zagreb if we have no evidence? And it's exactly the same problem we have in Albania. How do you value a shopping centre in Albania if one's never been sold to an institutional investor? You have to look at other countries and then make difference in terms of costs of finance or country risk and make assumptions as a value, and it's very, very difficult to do. And so when we're talking about yields in our markets, it's our best assumptions because we don't have enough evidence to say, right, that is definitely where the yield level is. If you were to ask 10 valuers in Bulgaria, you would get 10 different answers. But if you were to ask 10 valuers in Prague, you might get 3 or 4 different answers. And that's the challenge in our market, is valuing real estate, because it's based upon assumption, it's not based upon fact. And that's where your job as a valuer is very, very difficult in our region, and it makes it more difficult. So when we're talking about yields, we put numbers, these are our best estimates as where we see yields at the moment. We will see an increase in yields, we'll certainly see an increase in retail yields, probably not a huge increase, but we will see a lack of interest in retail going forward, and that will have an impact on the attractiveness of retail as an investment product. In terms of Albania as an investment market, it's really young in terms of its market. Obviously, again, we're talking about yield levels, but we're not seeing evidence. That's not bad. It's the same as every market. It's no different to Serbia. It's no different to North Macedonia. It's no different to all of these countries. Bosnia, we all have the same problem. We don't have any investment activity, and therefore it's very difficult to talk about yields. Where Albania does see investment is in hotels. We do see some deals happening in hotels. The hotel market for Albania is massive potential. If you look at Croatia, now Montenegro, Albania is obviously the next step going forward. That's where we see the biggest growth in Albania. It's not something that myself, I'm not a hotel expert, it's not something I'm comfortable talking too much about. I'm sure there's people on this call that know more about hotels than I do. But in terms of interest we get from our clients, it tends to be for hotels for Albania and not offices, shopping centres and industrial. And we will see slowly new developers coming in. We won't see the Germans and the Americans and the Brits, but we will see the likes of some of the Israeli money coming in, Greek money coming in, because these are the type of developers that do develop in our markets that aren't there yet. And so there will be a slow shift. At the moment, it's mainly local developers building. We see a lot of buildings that have more than one owner, which causes a huge problem in terms of trying to sell that building. We've done work in Tirana before, and I did a lease renewal a few years ago for one of the banks in Tirana. And in one building, they had 4 different landlords. And it's very, very difficult to then do the lease renewals when you're dealing with different landlords at the same time. It also means that that building can't ever be sold, because an investor will not buy half a building. They'll only buy a single building. And so when you have multiple ownership for commercial assets, you lose your chance to sell it as an investment product. And so we do see a lot of multiple ownership in Albania, and that means it's very, very difficult then to sell the assets into the investment market. So it needs to be kept in mind too. Okay, so in terms of investment future, this is the most important side. Again, deals that were started last year are closing. We were doing a very large deal in Zagreb and in Belgrade, which didn't close, so we've had investors pulling out of big deals. But those deals that were kind of towards the end of the negotiations, it usually takes at least 6 months to close a deal in our region. Those deals that were kind of at the 5th and 6th months of negotiations tend to close. But where we're going to see the challenge going forward is new deals starting. We expect to see a huge drop in investment sales in the next 6, 12, 18 months. We won't see investors putting buildings on the market because they won't take a reduced value. And so what we'll see is that we'll see this wait and see approach. People won't sell buildings because they will be scared to see what values come back at them. and investors are also scared to go out and buy because they may see prices dropping in 6 months or 12 months' time, so they don't want to commit to pricing now. So it means that at the moment the investment markets are very, very quiet. In terms of risk, by far highest risk, hotel, as I said, it's not my speciality, but certainly nobody is buying hotels at the moment, and nobody's buying shopping centres or any retail at the moment. Where we'll see the sectors that will kind of stay quite strong, certainly logistics, interest is very high, and I think in the medium long term, the office markets will still be very strong, and so going forward, offices and logistics will be classed as the safe assets in our region. Hotel and retail will go through a very tough period. I think hotels will slowly bounce back as tourism starts rising and business travel starts rising. But for the retail sector, it will never recover to the level it was already at. And so it will have to adapt, and we will see a reduction in retail interest going forward. And like I say, delayed investments will, there will be a delay in investments going forward. There will be an increase of remote working. And we will see some offices downsizing. At the same time, we may see some global companies increasing their offices to create more space for people to work in a safe environment. So at the moment, it's a wait and see in terms of the offices. I think we've talked through that, and maybe I was a little bit too much now. So that's my hour. I think I've got 1 minute left. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. My email address is here if anybody has any direct questions to ask. It's a very difficult time. It's a very difficult situation. It's a very difficult time to do a presentation like this because I'm basing a lot on what I think could happen, not what I know will happen. So I think there's a lot of nervousness around the real estate markets around this virus. It's having huge impacts on everybody's day-to-day lives, but in terms of real estate, the impacts are enormous. And some will be short-term and others will be here to stay. And certainly with the retail market, that's where we'll probably see a longer-term hit. But there will be some positives coming out of it too. So I wouldn't say it's all bad, but it's certainly a very difficult and quiet time to be working in real estate at the moment.
I would like to thank you, Andrew, on behalf of Metropolitan University and Metropolitan Innovation Center for this eye-opening presentation. But one last request from you, if you have at least 5 more minutes for us for a short Q&A session. If the audience have some questions. Dear audience, you can use the chat tab to write questions. I see one question about, do you have any idea about Kosovo's market? So one question for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a market I love going down to Kosovo. As a British person, I'm very popular there. It's one of my favorite destinations. Yeah, I mean, we've worked in Kosovo. We worked on the shopping centre there that was expanded in the last couple of years. We did the work with EBRD that were financing it. Again, it's a very small market in terms of potential. We may see some office development, some office demand for there. The retail market is kind of satisfied with what is there now. I mean, for a long time, if you wanted to go to the cinema, people would go to Skopje. I mean, it was incredible to me that people would have to do that. But there has been some growth in Kosovo in the past few years. And with the retail that's already there and the expansion of the current mall, that's probably enough. It's a market that I think a lot of it comes to do with finance, that a lot of the major banks are not there. I think you've got EBRD that are obviously active. Raiffeisen are down there, but a lot of them won't finance a kind of large-scale real estate, so it tends to be quite small. But potential going forward, I think that the main potential going forward is probably on outsourcing. Again, it benefits sadly from a relatively high unemployment level and low labour costs, and actually very good language skills. And so that is a different people living there, that the labour supply is high and the labour costs are low, but it's a good recipe for outsourcing. So we are seeing a bit of interest in terms of that. But for things like manufacturing, I think it's too small. But certainly for offices, I see demand. But I think it will be the banks that will dictate how easy it will be to develop. But it's certainly an interesting market.
Okay. So I believe we don't receive any more questions. So thank you again, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Bye. Have a nice evening.
Thanks.
This conference is no longer being recorded.